The doorbell rang 3 times, sharp and impatient, the kind of ringing that doesn't ask but demands. I was standing in the kitchen, staring at a cup of tea I'd forgotten to drink, watching the steam curl upward like it was trying to escape the room. I didn't need to look out the window to know who it was. My son never announced himself unless he wanted something. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and walked slowly down the hallway. Each step felt heavier than it should have, as if the house itself was resisting the moment. When I reached the front door, I paused, hand hovering over the handle. Through the frosted glass, I could see the blurred outline of a tall figure shifting impatiently from one foot to the other. I opened the door. He stood there with his phone in one hand and a folder tucked under his arm, eyes already scanning past me into the house as if it were still his. He leaned in and brushed his cheek against mine, a quick, empty gesture that passed for affection. "Mom," he said, "we need to talk." He didn't wait for an answer. He stepped inside, moving with the confidence of someone who had never been told no. I closed the door behind him and followed as he walked straight into the kitchen, pulled out a chair, and sat at the table. My chair. He placed the folder in front of him and immediately went back to scrolling on his phone. "A coffee would be nice," he said, not looking up. My body moved before my mind did. I filled the kettle, reached for a mug, measured out the coffee grounds by instinct. 10 years a widow, and I was still serving men like it was written into my bones. As the coffee brewed, I studied him quietly. His jaw was tight, his fingers tapping against the screen, knuckles pale with tension. He looked just like his father when he was under pressure. Same posture, same restless energy, same expectation that someone else would fix things. I set the cup down in front of him. "Thank you," he muttered, finally glancing up. He took a sip, then leaned back in his chair and exhaled sharply, as if bracing himself. "I'll get straight to it," he said. "I need money." My stomach tightened, though part of me had already known this was coming. He slid the folder across the table toward me with 2 fingers, casual, like he was passing a utility bill. "It's my wife's debt," he continued. 300,000. The words hung in the air, heavy and unreal. $300,000. I opened the folder slowly. Inside were bank statements, loan notices, documents stamped with red ink. My vision blurred as I scanned the numbers. That amount wasn't just money. It was my retirement, my safety, the last remains of the life I'd built after burying my husband. "That's nearly everything I have," I said quietly. He shrugged. "You don't really need it." I looked up at him, searching his face for some sign of hesitation, some flicker of concern. There was none. "You live alone," he went on. "The house is paid off. Your expenses are minimal. You're almost 70. What are you even saving for?" The words landed like a slap. I felt heat rush to my face, a mix of shame and disbelief. For a moment, I couldn't speak. The ticking of the clock on the wall seemed unbearably loud, counting out seconds I would never get back. "I still have medications," I said finally. "Doctor visits, emergencies." He waved a hand dismissively. "This isn't about that. These people aren't banks, Mom. If we don't pay them by tomorrow, things will get bad." "How bad?" I asked. "You don't need the details," he snapped. "Just trust me." Trust. That word had ruled my life for decades. Trust your husband. Trust your son. Trust that giving more would somehow make things better. I stared at the folder again, at the numbers that felt like a verdict. "I need time," I said. "There is no time," he replied sharply. "I need it today, not tomorrow, today." He stood up and came around the table, placing a hand on my shoulder. His grip was firm, possessive. My skin crawled under his touch. "This is for family," he said, his voice suddenly softer. "For your grandchildren, for my wife's safety. Don't let me down, Mom." Something inside me twisted. That phrase, "don't let me down," had followed me my entire life. I'd heard it from my husband when he wanted control disguised as concern. I was hearing it again now, from my own son. "All right," I whispered. The relief on his face was immediate. He smiled, a real smile this time, and squeezed my shoulder. "I knew I could count on you," he said. "I'll come back tonight. We'll have dinner." He grabbed the folder, kissed my forehead, and headed for the door. Just before leaving, he turned back. "Don't forget," he added lightly. "Today." The door slammed shut behind him. I stood there, staring at the untouched coffee on the table. Outside, his car sped away, gravel scattering across the driveway I'd tended for years. My hands were shaking, though I hadn't moved. I knew, with a clarity that terrified me, that I had just agreed to something I might never recover from. And yet, beneath the fear, another feeling stirred. Small, dangerous, unfamiliar, an idea. I sat at the kitchen table long after he left, the folder still open in front of me like an accusation. The numbers refused to stay still. 300,000. I tried to tell myself it was just money, that family mattered more, that I'd survived worse. But the truth pressed in from all sides. This wasn't the first time. It was just the largest. My hands moved mechanically as I logged into my bank account. I told myself I was only checking, only looking. The balance glowed back at me, familiar and suddenly fragile. Retirement savings. Proceeds from selling the condo downtown after Edward died. Years of careful restraint, of saying no to myself so I could say yes to others. I hesitated, cursor hovering over the transfer button. I thought of the first time Richard had asked for help. He'd been younger then, nervous, insisting it was temporary. 50,000 to cover a supplier issue. He'd promised to repay me within months. He never did. Then there was another request, then another. Each time the amount grew. Each time the tone hardened. Gratitude faded, replaced by expectation. "Family helps family," he'd said back then. I pressed the button. The screen refreshed. The balance dropped to a number that looked unreal, too small to belong to me. A hollow ache spread through my chest. I closed the laptop and sat very still, as if moving might shatter something irreparable. Hours passed without my noticing. Evening light slanted through the window, casting long shadows across the floor. I should have started dinner. I should have cried. Instead, I felt numb, like the moment after bad news sinks in but before the pain arrives. That was when the phone rang. I stared at it for several seconds before answering. It was Richard. "Did you do it?" he asked, skipping any greeting. "Yes," I said. There was a pause, then a breath of relief. "Good. That takes care of it." "That takes care of what exactly?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. "Don't start, Mom," he said sharply. "This isn't the time. I'll explain later." Later. Always later. I hung up without another word. The house felt unbearably silent after that. I walked from room to room, touching familiar objects as if to reassure myself they were still real. The couch Edward and I had bought together, the framed photos on the wall, the garden outside, roses blooming stubbornly despite the poor soil. Everything looked the same, yet something fundamental had shifted. It was nearly midnight when headlights swept across the front of the house. I froze. His car pulled into the driveway. Then another unfamiliar one. I stood in the hallway, heart pounding, listening to doors slam and voices murmur outside. Laughter drifted in, sharp and careless. My son and his wife. They were here to collect what was left of me. I didn't move. I didn't turn on the lights. I stood there in the dark, and for the first time, I felt something other than fear. I felt anger. Cold, focused, and long overdue. By the time they knocked, the house was already empty. Not empty of furniture, but of me. Earlier that evening, after the call ended, the idea that had flickered to life finally took shape. I'd picked up the phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in years. "Marissa," I'd said when she answered. "It's Diane. I need your help." She arrived within half an hour, her hair streaked with gray now, her eyes as sharp as ever. She took one look at my face and knew this wasn't a social visit. "How much?" she asked. 300,000, I replied. She nearly dropped her tea. "Diane, that's everything." I nodded. I know. She didn't waste time with sympathy. That was never her way. "Why do you keep letting him do this?" The question cut deeper than anything Richard had said. I opened my mouth, then closed it. The answer that came out surprised me, because I've been trained to. Marissa leaned back, studying me. "By your husband, and now by your son." Something inside me cracked, and for the first time, I didn't rush to repair it. I don't want to do this anymore, I said. I don't want to be afraid. Her lips curved into a slow, approving smile. Then we moved fast. We went to the bank that same night. Emergency transfers, new accounts, paperwork signed with hands that trembled but didn't stop. She called a colleague, arranged legal representation, talked about protective measures I'd never dared to consider. Are you sure? The bank manager asked, glancing between us. I'm completely sure, I said, and for once I meant it. By the time Richard and his wife arrived at the house, everything that mattered was gone. Not the furniture, not the walls, but the access, the control, the certainty that I would always be there to bleed quietly for them. I left a single envelope on the kitchen table. Inside, a short note. You taught me that love means sacrifice. I finally learned it also means limits. When the doorbell rang again, louder this time, I was already halfway down the highway. Suitcase in the trunk, my phone turned off. For the first time in my life, I wasn't running toward someone else's crisis. I was running toward myself. I didn't sleep that night. The road stretched endlessly ahead of us, dark and unfamiliar, lit only by the steady sweep of headlights and the occasional glow of passing signs. Marissa drove, one hand on the wheel, the other resting calmly on the armrest, as if we were heading out on an ordinary trip instead of dismantling the life I'd lived for nearly 70 years. Are you afraid? She asked after a long stretch of silence. Yes, I admitted. My voice sounded thin even to me. And relieved. And guilty. She nodded. That's what freedom feels like at first. It's messy. The word settled into me. Freedom. I'd never associated it with myself. Responsibility? Yes. Duty. Sacrifice. But freedom had always felt like something reserved for other people. By the time we reached the small coastal town where Marissa owned a vacant condo, the sky was beginning to lighten. I stepped out of the car and inhaled the salty air, sharp and clean. It felt like breathing for the first time after years underwater. The condo was modest. One bedroom, a small balcony overlooking the ocean, furniture chosen for comfort rather than display. It wasn't impressive, and that was exactly what I loved about it. This is yours for as long as you need, Marissa said, handing me the keys. I stood there, keys heavy in my palm, overwhelmed by a generosity that came without strings attached. That morning, I turned my phone back on. 17 missed calls. Richard. His wife. My sister. Numbers I didn't recognize. Voicemails stacked one after another, each more urgent than the last. I didn't listen to them. I silenced the phone and set it face down on the table. They'll escalate, Marissa said calmly, watching me. Especially when they realize they've lost access. I know, I replied. And I did. I knew him. I knew the way entitlement curdled into rage when denied. I also knew that going back now would erase everything I'd just done. Over the next few days, I began to piece together a life that belonged only to me. I opened a new bank account in my own name. I rented a small apartment nearby, something affordable and manageable. I unpacked my suitcase slowly, choosing what deserved space in this new chapter. I sold baked goods and embroidery at the local weekend fair, something I'd done quietly for years without ever calling it work. To my surprise, people lined up. They asked about patterns, about recipes, about me. No one saw me as a wallet. They saw me as a person. A week later, the first letter arrived. It was from Richard's lawyer. Formal, cold, accusing. It demanded my immediate return, citing concerns about my mental health and threatening to take control of my finances. Enclosed was a handwritten note from my daughter-in-law, desperate and trembling with need. Please come back. Things are out of control. We need you. I handed everything to Marissa. He's panicking, she said after reading. He's trying to scare you back into place. Will it work? I asked quietly. Only if you let it. We responded through legal channels. Calm, firm, documented. Medical records confirming my mental soundness. A detailed list of every transfer I'd ever made to my son, complete with dates and amounts. The silence that followed was deafening, until the knock came. I wasn't expecting anyone when the doorbell rang that afternoon. I opened the door cautiously. My daughter-in-law stood there, thinner than I remembered, Eyes shadowed, hands clasped tightly together. "May I come in?" she asked. I hesitated, then stepped aside. She looked around the apartment, clearly surprised by its simplicity. "It's small," she said. "It's mine," I replied. We sat on the balcony, the ocean stretching endlessly before us. She cradled her cup of tea as if it were an anchor. "Things are bad," she whispered. "Worse than you know. The debt is bigger. The people we owe, they're not patient." A chill ran through me. "He told them you still had money," she added softly. In that moment, something inside me went very still. "He used me as collateral," I said, not as a question, but a statement. She didn't deny it. "You need to leave," I told her. "Take the kids. Go somewhere safe." Her eyes filled with tears. "He controls everything. Accounts, documents, even my phone." I reached for her hand, surprised by the steadiness in my own. "I can't help you with money," I said, "but I can help you get out." Hope flickered across her face, fragile and dangerous. After she left, carrying a new phone hidden in her boot, and a plan whispered carefully into existence, I sat alone on the balcony and watched the sun dip into the sea. My phone rang. It was Marissa. "He came to my office today," she said without preamble, "with someone unpleasant. They wanted to know where you were." My heart raced. "What did you tell them?" "That if they so much as touched you, I'd make sure they spent the rest of their lives explaining themselves in court." There was a pause. "Diane," she added softly, "this is getting dangerous." I watched the sky darken, the horizon bleeding orange and purple. "I know," I said, "and that's why I can't go back." For the first time, I understood something I'd never dared to admit before. Leaving hadn't created the danger. It had exposed it. The next morning, I woke to the sound of waves instead of alarms, and for a brief moment, I forgot everything. Then reality settled back in. Slow, heavy, unavoidable. The threats, the debts, the knowledge that my son had been willing to put me in harm's way to save himself. I made tea and sat at the small kitchen table, hands wrapped around the warm mug, trying to steady my breathing. This was the part no one talked about when they spoke of courage. The quiet aftermath, when fear crept in through the cracks left behind by decisive action. My phone buzzed on the table. A text message. Unknown number. "Call me now." No name, no explanation. I didn't. A few minutes later, it rang again. Then again. Each vibration sent a jolt through my chest. I silenced the phone and slid it into a drawer, but the tension stayed, humming beneath my skin. That afternoon, there was another knock at the door. This time, when I looked through the peephole, I saw a woman holding a badge. "Mrs. Miller?" she asked gently when I opened the door just enough to speak. "I'm Detective Alvarez. May we talk?" I stepped aside, my heart pounding. She sat on the couch, posture professional but not unkind. "Your son is under investigation," she said plainly. "Financial fraud, forged documents, connections to illegal lenders." The words knocked the air from my lungs. I'd suspected something wasn't right, but hearing it said aloud felt like the ground giving way beneath me. "Did you know?" she asked. "I knew he had money problems," I replied honestly. "I didn't know he was committing crimes." She nodded, jotting notes. "He used accounts in your name, loans you may not have been aware of." My stomach twisted. "He told me it was to protect me." She met my eyes. "That's a common tactic." I told her everything. The repeated loans, the pressure, the last demand for $300,000, the way he'd spoken to me like I was an inconvenience rather than his mother. When she stood to leave, she paused. "You should be careful," she said. "Desperate people do desperate things." That evening, Marissa arrived, suitcase in hand, refusing to leave me alone. We installed cameras, changed locks, filed paperwork I never thought I'd need in my lifetime. Still, the fear followed me like a shadow. Then the message came from my daughter-in-law. "He's smashing things. I'm locked in the bedroom with the kids. Please help." My hands shook as I called the detective back. Within minutes, police were on their way to my son's house. The hours that followed blurred together. Calls, updates, waiting. By nightfall, I learned the children were safe. My son was not. When Marissa found me later, I was sitting on the balcony, staring out at the dark water. "I feel guilty," I whispered. "If I hadn't left..." She cut me off. If you hadn't left, this would have happened anyway. You just wouldn't have survived it. The next morning, his face stared back at me from the newspaper. Local businessman arrested for fraud and links to organized crime. The photo showed a man I barely recognized, hands cuffed, eyes wild. The phone rang again. This time it was the detective. "He wants to see you," she said. "He'll only talk to you." I closed my eyes. I'd spent my life avoiding confrontation, smoothing things over, absorbing blame. But this wasn't something I could run from. "I'll come," I said. Not because I owed him anything, but because I needed to end this on my terms. The police station smelled like disinfectant and old paper, a sterile place where emotions felt out of place but unavoidable. Marissa waited in the car, insisting she'd be right there when I came out. I appreciated that more than I could say. For once, I wasn't walking into something alone. They led me into a small visitation room. A thick glass partition split the space in two, with a phone mounted on each side. I sat down slowly, smoothing my hands over my skirt, aware of every breath I took. A moment later, the door on the other side opened. My son walked in, wearing a plain gray uniform, his hands cuffed in front of him. He looked smaller somehow, stripped of the confidence he wore like armor. When he saw me, his face changed instantly. Relief, fear, and something close to desperation flickered across his features. "Mom," he said, picking up the phone. "You came." "I said I would," I replied, lifting the receiver. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. He leaned forward, eyes searching my face. "I'm in serious trouble. You don't understand how bad this is. Those people, they're not going to wait." I felt a familiar pull. That instinct to fix, to rescue, to absorb consequences that weren't mine. For a split second, the old reflex surged up inside me. Then I remembered the envelope on my kitchen table. The way he'd said, "Don't let me down," like a threat. "I understand enough," I said calmly. "You broke the law. You used my name. You put me in danger." His expression hardened. "I did what I had to do. For my family." "No," I said, surprising even myself with the firmness in my voice. "You did what you wanted to do, and you expected me to pay for it." He slammed his cuffed hands against the table, the sound echoing sharply. "You left when I needed you most." I didn't flinch. "I stopped enabling you when I realized staying would destroy me." He stared at me, stunned, as if hearing a foreign language. "The house is still in my name," he said finally, his voice cold. "You have nothing." I met his gaze through the glass. "I have myself. That's what you never understood." There was silence between us, thick and heavy. Then his voice dropped, urgent again. "You have to help me, Mom. Just one more time." I shook my head slowly. This is where it ends. When I stood to leave, his face twisted with rage. "This isn't over," he hissed. "You'll regret this." I paused at the door, my hand resting on the handle. For a moment, I looked back at the boy I'd once rocked to sleep, the man he'd become, and the cycle that had bound us together for so long. "Maybe," I said quietly, "but not today." Outside, the sunlight felt blinding after the harsh fluorescent lights inside. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with air that felt cleaner, freer. Marissa watched me carefully as I got into the car. "How do you feel?" she asked. I stared straight ahead, the building shrinking in the distance. "Lighter," I said, and terrified, but mostly lighter. For the first time, I understood something that changed everything. The moment I stopped trying to save him was the moment I finally saved myself. I thought the worst was behind me. That was my mistake. The days after visiting the police station settled into a fragile routine. Mornings at the market, afternoons stitching by the window, evenings walking along the beach as the sun dipped low and painted the water gold. From the outside, my life looked peaceful. Inside, I was constantly listening, watching strangers a little too closely, memorizing cars parked too long near my building. Freedom, I was learning, didn't arrive quietly. It arrived guarded. Marissa stayed close. She checked in every morning, reviewed my mail, monitored calls I didn't answer. We spoke in the language of people who understood risk without dramatizing it. "He's lost control," she told me one evening as we sat on the balcony. "People like him don't accept that easily." As if summoned by her words, my phone rang. Unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. A minute later, a message appeared. Mrs. Miller, we need to talk. This is in your best interest. My pulse quickened, but my voice stayed steady when I played it for Marissa. That's not a lawyer, she said immediately. That's pressure. The next day, a letter arrived. No return address. Inside was a single printed page. You owe people who don't like being ignored. I sat very still, paper trembling in my hands. That afternoon, Detective Alvarez came back. They're trying to scare you, she said bluntly after reading the letter. And it's working, isn't it? I nodded. Yes, she didn't sugarcoat it. Your son has been talking, trying to negotiate, using you as leverage. My stomach dropped. He's still doing this? He never stopped. That night, sleep refused to come. Every sound outside felt amplified. Footsteps, voices, a car door slamming somewhere down the street. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, thinking about all the years I'd confused endurance with strength. Near dawn, a message came from my daughter-in-law. He found out I talked to you. I'm scared. That was the moment everything shifted. Fear for myself was something I could manage. Fear for children, my grandchildren, cut straight through every defense I'd built. I called Marissa immediately. We can't just react anymore, I said. We need to be ahead of him. She was quiet for a moment, then nodded. Then we stopped playing defense. By mid-morning, Detective Alvarez had looped in a specialized unit. Financial crimes, witness protection, safety planning. Words I never imagined applying to my life. He's desperate now, Alvarez warned, and desperation makes people reckless. That afternoon, my daughter-in-law showed up at my door. Her face was pale, eyes hollow with exhaustion. She looked around before stepping inside, as if expecting him to materialize behind her. He sold the car, she whispered. He's trying to sell the condo. He says it's all temporary, but I don't believe him anymore. I took her hands in mine. They were cold, shaking. You don't have to believe him, I said. You just have to get out. Tears spilled down her cheeks. I don't know how. I looked at her, and for the first time, I wasn't speaking as a victim or a mother desperate to keep peace. I was speaking as someone who had already crossed the line she was still standing behind. You start by choosing yourself, I said, even if you're terrified. We made a plan. Careful. Quiet. No money involved. Just logistics, timing, and people who knew how to help. That night, after she left, I stood alone on the balcony again. The ocean was restless, waves crashing harder than usual. I realized then that this wasn't just about escape anymore. It was about ending something that had been allowed to grow unchecked for far too long. And once that thought took root, I knew there was no turning back. The call came just after midnight. I was half asleep on the couch, the television murmuring softly in the background, when my phone vibrated against the coffee table. Marissa had finally gone home to rest, though she insisted on keeping her ringer on full volume. I reached for the phone, my heart already racing. It was Detective Alvarez. They move faster than we expected, she said without preamble. Your daughter-in-law and the children are safe, but your son resisted when officers arrived. I closed my eyes, exhaling slowly. Is anyone hurt? No, she replied. But he was arrested for obstruction and aggressive behavior. This changes things. I sat up, suddenly wide awake. How? He's no longer just a financial suspect. This becomes a pattern of escalation. When the call ended, the silence felt heavier than before. I stared out at the dark ocean, waves barely visible under the moonlight. Somewhere deep inside, a painful truth settled into place. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't stress. This wasn't a bad phase. This was who my son had become. The next morning, the news broke quietly, tucked into a local column rather than splashed across headlines. Business owner arrested following domestic disturbance. I read the article twice, my name conspicuously absent. For that, I was grateful. Marissa arrived later that day with groceries and a determined look. He's unraveling, she said. And when people like him unravel, they try to pull everyone else down with them. As if on cue, my phone rang. A blocked number. I didn't answer. The voicemail came seconds later. Mom, Richard's voice said, unsteady but sharp. You think you've won? You've destroyed this family. If anything happens to me, this is on you. I listened to the message twice, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to hear it clearly, to strip it of its power. I handed the phone to Marissa. She shook her head. That's a threat. Yes, I said. And a confession. That afternoon, Detective Alvarez returned with a uniformed officer. They reviewed the message, took screenshots, documented everything. We're recommending protective measures, Alvarez said carefully. Temporary relocation, increased surveillance. I looked around my apartment. The plants on the balcony. The embroidery folded neatly on the table. The quiet I'd worked so hard to build. I'm not running again, I said. She studied me. This isn't about fear, it's about safety. I know, I replied. But I've spent my life shrinking to avoid conflict. I won't do it anymore. There was a long pause. Then Alvarez nodded. Then we do this another way. The plan was simple, terrifying, and precise. We would wait. If Richard was still trying to control things from the outside, he would make a mistake. People like him always did. He would reach out to the wrong person, say the wrong thing, push too far. All I had to do was continue living my life as if nothing had changed. For 3 days, I followed my routine. The market, the beach, the cafe on the corner where the barista knew my name. Every step felt like walking a tightrope. On the 4th morning, I noticed a man across the street. He stood near a utility pole, pretending to scroll on his phone, but his eyes kept lifting toward my building. When our gazes met briefly, something cold passed between us. I stepped back inside and locked the door. My hands were steady as I dialed Alvarez. I think he's here, I said. Within minutes, the pieces moved into place. Unmarked cars, plainclothes officers, a cleaning woman who wasn't a cleaning woman at all. I sat in the living room, heart pounding so loudly I was sure it could be heard from the hallway. The doorbell rang. I stood, smoothed my shirt, and walked to the door. Yes? I said, opening it just enough. Mrs. Miller? The man asked. I have a message for you. Before he could say another word, officers stepped out from both sides and pinned him to the ground. He didn't resist. In fact, he looked almost relieved. When Alvarez arrived later, her face was grim. He was hired to scare you, she said. Not kill you. Just enough to make you compliant again. And my son? I asked quietly. She met my eyes. He ordered it. Something inside me went very still. That was the moment the last thread of doubt snapped. Not anger, not grief, clarity. The line between mother and son had finally been crossed beyond repair. And I knew without hesitation that I would never step back over it again. They arrested him again. This time it wasn't confusion or circumstantial evidence or legal gray areas. It was recorded calls, traced payments, a confession from the man who'd stood outside my building pretending to be invisible. Detective Alvarez sat across from me at the small dining table, folders spread neatly between us. Her voice was calm, professional, but there was no softening the truth. He promised him money to frighten you, she said. Property damage, threats, enough to make you feel unsafe in your own home. I stared at the grain of the wooden table, following a dark line with my eyes. Did he say why? Alvarez hesitated. He said you needed to be reminded who still had power. The words landed harder than any insult my son had ever thrown at me. Not because they surprised me, but because they confirmed something I'd spent years refusing to see. To him, I had never been a person. I had been a resource, a lever, a possession. And now? I asked. Now, she said. He's facing additional charges, solicitation of violence, intimidation of a witness. Any chance of early release just disappeared. I nodded slowly. My hands didn't shake. My chest didn't tighten. Instead, a strange calm settled over me, like the quiet after a storm finally passes. That afternoon, Marissa arrived with a bottle of wine I didn't feel like opening. I keep thinking I should feel something more, I told her as we sat on the balcony. Anger, grief, relief. And what do you feel? She asked. Final, I said after a moment. Like a door closed behind me and I didn't even hear it shut. She reached over and squeezed my hand. That's not coldness, that's acceptance. A week later, I went back to the police station. Not because I was summoned, because I chose to go. Richard sat behind the glass again, thinner than before, eyes bloodshot, jaw clenched tight. When he saw me, something like panic flashed across his face. You did this, he said the moment the phone connected. You ruined everything. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't defend myself. No, I replied calmly. You did this. I just stopped protecting you from it. He laughed bitterly. You think this makes you strong? You're old. Alone. What kind of life is that? I looked at him for a long moment. Really looked. The desperation. The fury. The emptiness where accountability should have been. It's a peaceful one, I said. And it's mine. He slammed his hand against the glass. This isn't over. I stood up. For you, maybe, I said. For me, it is. As I walked out of the station, sunlight flooded the steps outside. I paused, letting it warm my face, aware of something remarkable. For the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for someone else's reaction. I wasn't bracing for consequences. I had crossed the point of no return. And instead of fear, I felt power. Quiet, solid, unshakable. The kind no one could ever take from me again. Life didn't suddenly become easy after that. It became real. The weeks that followed were filled with practical adjustments rather than emotional explosions. Court documents arrived. Meetings were scheduled. Statements were given. Everything moved forward in an orderly, impersonal way that contrasted sharply with the chaos my son had created. Richard was transferred to a high-security facility while prosecutors added the new charges. Marissa handled most of the communication, filtering what I needed to know and shielding me from the rest. He's furious, she told me one evening, scrolling through an email from the district attorney. But fury doesn't help him anymore. I nodded, focused on threading a needle. My hands were steadier now. The embroidery hoop rested comfortably in my lap, the pattern emerging slowly, patiently. I found comfort in the rhythm of it. Proof that not everything had to be rushed or forced. News traveled faster than I expected. A woman stopped me at the market one morning, her eyes cautious but kind. You're Diane, aren't you? She asked quietly. I just wanted to say, I'm glad you got out. I didn't ask how she knew. In small towns, stories had a way of spreading, especially ones about women who finally said no. More followed. A brief conversation at the cafe. A note slipped into my bag at the fair. Thank you for showing it's possible. It unsettled me at first. I'd never thought of myself as an example. I'd spent most of my life trying not to be noticed at all. One afternoon, my daughter-in-law called. Her voice sounded different. Stronger. We've moved, she said. The kids are starting school next week. I smiled, a genuine one this time. I'm proud of you. There was a pause. I don't know what happens next, she admitted. With him. You don't have to decide everything at once, I said. Just decide what keeps you safe. That night, as I walked along the beach, the wind sharp against my skin, I realized something important. My son's power had never come from money or intimidation. It had come from my silence, and that silence was gone. A month later, I received a letter. It wasn't threatening. It wasn't manipulative. It was an apology. Not the kind that asks for forgiveness or absolution, but the kind that simply admits wrongdoing and accepts consequences. It was brief, controlled, possibly rehearsed. I read it once, then set it aside. Forgiveness, I'd learned, wasn't an obligation. It was a choice, and one that didn't need to be rushed. Instead, I focused on building what was in front of me. A small business that grew slowly but honestly. Friendships rooted in respect rather than need. Mornings that began without dread. I hadn't won. I had stepped out of a game that was never meant to be survivable. And that, I realized, was the greatest victory of all. The morning I turned 70, I woke up before sunrise. The apartment was quiet, washed in soft blue light, the ocean barely visible through the balcony doors. I wrapped a shawl around my shoulders and stepped outside, letting the cool air settle against my skin. For years, birthdays had been reminders of what I'd lost. My husband, my youth, my usefulness in other people's eyes. This one felt different. It felt earned. My phone buzzed softly on the table behind me. Messages from Marissa, from my daughter-in-law, from friends I'd made here. People who knew me not as someone's wife or someone's mother, but simply as Diane. Later that day, I walked to the cafe near the beach, the one where the owner always saved me a corner table. A small group of women were already there, chatting quietly, notebooks and folders spread out between cups of coffee. What had started as a few conversations had grown into something more. An informal support circle for women who'd lived under financial or emotional control. They looked up when I arrived, smiling. "Ready?" one of them asked. I nodded and took my seat. I didn't tell my story in dramatic terms. I didn't need to. I spoke plainly about patterns, about how control often disguises itself as care, about how saying no feels like betrayal only when you've been trained to believe your needs don't matter. I thought leaving would destroy my family, I said. What it destroyed was a lie. There were tears. There was laughter. There was a kind of understanding that didn't require explanation. That evening, after everyone left, I walked home alone, the sky streaked with orange and violet. I passed the park where children were playing, couples strolling, people living ordinary lives untouched by the chaos that had once consumed mine. At home, I opened my journal. Today, I wrote, I understand something I couldn't before. Peace doesn't come from fixing other people. It comes from choosing yourself without apology. I thought of my son, not with the sharp pain that used to accompany his memory, but with a distant sadness that no longer defined me. I wished him accountability. I wished him change, but I no longer wished myself smaller to make either of those things possible. I closed the journal and looked around my apartment. The plants I'd nurtured, the embroidery on the walls, the life I'd built with intention instead of fear. This wasn't the ending I'd once imagined for myself. It was better, because it wasn't an ending at all. It was the moment I finally stepped into a life that belonged to me, and decided without hesitation to stay there.